Hey everyone, welcome to Dark Dossier. Before we dive into the video, comment your city down below. I wanna see where you're all tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out. Let's get started. Story 1. The 17th century bank robbery that happened entirely on paper. Imagine yourself in the heart of 17th century Europe. The bustling streets of Amsterdam, London, or Venice are filled with merchants, sailors, and clerks, all moving with a sense of urgency. It is an era of expansion, where ships carry spices, textiles, and gold across oceans, and trade fuels the growing wealth of cities. But beneath this prosperity lies a fragile truth. The systems that hold the world of money together are still in their infancy. Banking is not yet the well-regulated machine you might imagine today. Instead, it is a loose framework of trust, paper promises, and handwritten ledgers. At the core of this fragile economy are the banks, many of them private institutions or family-run operations, whose reputations matter more than laws. Customers deposit coins, heavy, clinking bags of silver and gold into vaults in exchange for something lighter, a receipt or a bill. That paper represents the value stored inside the vault. To you, a 17th century merchant, the paper is more useful than carrying metal. You can trade it, sign it over to someone else, and it circulates as a form of currency. In essence, paper money is being born. But with every innovation comes vulnerability. Where there is trust, there is the opportunity for deception. And in this new world of banking, fraud takes on a quiet, almost invisible form. Instead of breaking locks or wielding weapons, clever criminals learn to steal by manipulating ink on paper. This is the world in which one of history's strangest robberies unfolds, a robbery in which not a single vault is broken, not a single guard overpowered, and not a single coin touched. Banking before banks as we know them. In the early 1600s, Amsterdam's Wisselbank Exchange Bank had become the model of financial reliability. Founded in 1609, it sought to bring order to the chaos of Europe's currency system. Merchants across Europe trusted its books because it offered something radical: standardized, guaranteed payments on paper. Imagine standing in a noisy tavern, passing along a folded slip of parchment that states you own 1,000 guilders deposited in the Wisselbank. The innkeeper accepts it without hesitation, not because of who you are, but because of the reputation of the bank itself. This was revolutionary. Paper had become money. But such dependence on trust also opened cracks in the system. Banks relied on clerks, ordinary men with quills, ink pots, and ledgers to record every transaction faithfully. A simple line of writing could represent fortunes, and an error or deliberate manipulation could make money appear or vanish in an instant. The men behind the ledgers. The story centers on a few individuals whose names may not ring out in history like kings or generals, but whose quiet actions changed the fate of fortunes. One such figure was a bank clerk, a man employed to write transactions into the official book. His job was considered menial yet critical. A slip of his pen could cost a merchant thousands or destroy the reputation of the institution. Unlike today, there were no computers to double-check his entries, no independent oversight. He was the living interface between promise and reality. And in this vulnerability, he saw his chance. A crime without locks. The plan was simple in theory but audacious in execution. Alter the bank's books so that certain entries credited more than was actually deposited. With careful forgeries, he could inflate balances, issue fraudulent receipts, and manipulate paper to create wealth where none existed. Unlike a masked robbery that drew instant suspicion, this crime lived in the quiet shuffle of paper. Customers who held receipts didn't immediately know they had been forged. Merchants carried on their trades, unaware that the paper they trusted represented nothing in the vaults. What made this crime so powerful was its invisibility. When gold is stolen, the vault is lighter the next morning. But when paper is manipulated, The vault remains untouched. The theft exists only in the imagination, in the ink of the ledger. The first whispers. For months, perhaps even years, no one noticed. The fraudulent slips of paper moved through the economy like legitimate currency. Merchants accepted them, banks honored them, and the system rolled on. It was only when inconsistencies appeared, when the bank's records didn't align with the metal in storage, that suspicion grew. Auditors began to whisper. Quiet investigations started, but even then it was difficult to prove. How could anyone untangle which receipts were real and which were born of forgery? The handwriting matched. The seals appeared legitimate. The clerks themselves, the very men trusted with safeguarding the records, were the only ones who knew the truth. The fragility of trust. This crime revealed something unsettling. The entire system of early banking rested on trust, not on hard metal. Coins could be counted, weighed, and locked away. But the paper that represented them existed only because people collectively agreed to honor it. Once that trust was shaken, the entire economy could wobble. Merchants who learned of the suspicions began to panic. Would their paper receipts be honored tomorrow? Would the bank collapse under the weight of invisible fraud? The authorities faced a terrifying possibility: a crime that could not only ruin individuals but potentially destabilize trade across entire regions. A quiet panic. In a modern robbery, you picture alarm bells, police sirens, and dramatic pursuits. But in this case, the alarm was a whispered doubt in a merchant's ear, a hesitation when accepting a receipt, a glance of suspicion at a bank clerk's steady hand. The panic spread slowly, almost silently. But to those living through it, the unease was suffocating. By the time investigators began to piece the scheme together, the damage was already done. You're sitting in a 17th century counting room, the kind with heavy wooden tables, quills sharpened to fine points, and ledgers stacked so tall they look like they might crush the desk beneath them. The air is dry with parchment dust. Somewhere, a clerk coughs nervously. It is here, in these ledgers, that a silent robbery is about to be exposed. The whispers of fraud had turned into formal concern. The governors of the Wissel Bank, the respected exchange bank of Amsterdam, had heard enough complaints to suspect something larger at play. Merchants were reporting odd discrepancies. Some claimed their balances were not what they should be. Others noticed that receipts were being honored for amounts strangely high compared to the actual metal supposedly backing them. The auditors arrive. To you and me, an audit today sounds clinical, routine. But in the 17th century, when everything rested on handwritten ledgers, an audit was something closer to detective work. Men appointed by the city council sat down with quills and candlelight, cross-checking balances line by line. Every receipt was compared with its corresponding entry. Every coin in the vault was weighed and logged. At first, nothing obvious appeared. The forgeries were clever, the handwriting matched, seals looked genuine, but then patterns began to emerge. One clerk's entries appeared with unusual frequency in suspicious cases. Transactions tied to his hand were more likely to show inflated balances or inconsistencies. Slowly, the auditors traced these slips of ink back to their author. The clerk's hidden empire. This man, whose name slips in and out of obscure records, though historians suggest he may have been a mid-ranking clerk with direct access to the books, had created something like a shadow empire within the bank's walls. By forging receipts, he had quietly issued himself wealth that did not exist. What's striking is how carefully he balanced the fraud. He didn't create too much money at once. He let it seep into the system. He relied on the natural chaos of trade, the fact that merchants were constantly moving funds in and out to cover the false entries. But greed, as it so often does, pushed him too far. At some point, the amount of fictitious paper circulating simply couldn't be reconciled with the weight of the coins in the vault. A crime that shook confidence. The governors faced a terrifying realization. If word spread too quickly, the bank could collapse. Imagine thousands of merchants storming the counters, demanding their gold at once, only to find it wasn't there. The entire economy of Amsterdam, perhaps even Europe's broader trade network, could crumble overnight. So they acted with secrecy. The investigation was kept quiet, behind closed doors, while auditors worked frantically to trace the damage. The city council was informed but sworn to silence. Every effort was made to preserve public confidence. To admit the truth openly was unthinkable. The question of punishment. Now came the difficult part: what to do with the clerk. Unlike a violent robber caught with stolen goods, this was a man whose theft lived in ledgers and receipts. The coins had never left the vault, and yet his actions had already shaken the financial system. The authorities debated whether the case should be treated as fraud, forgery, or outright theft. Each charge carried different punishments, from imprisonment to public humiliation. In a society where reputation mattered almost more than wealth, the spectacle of punishment was part of the solution. It wasn't just about justice, it was about restoring faith in the system. Merchants on edge. As word of irregularities leaked for nothing could be kept truly secret in a trading city, merchants began to act nervously. Imagine being a spice trader, holding thousands of guilders in receipts, unsure whether they'd be honored tomorrow. Would you risk shipping your goods, or would you sit tight and wait? The docks slowed, deals hesitated, credit, that invisible lifeblood of commerce, faltered. The city understood. This was no longer about a single clerk or his forged receipts. It was about trust itself. The paper trail unravels. Investigators followed the trail as best they could. They compared receipts in circulation, tracked which merchants held them, and tried to match them back to vault balances. What they discovered was astonishing. Some merchants, knowingly or unknowingly, were trading on receipts that had no backing at all. In effect, they were passing along paper that represented air. Here lies the true danger of such crimes. Unlike stolen gold, which can be tracked and recovered, false paper spreads like a contagion. By the time the fraud was uncovered, the forged receipts had circulated far beyond the bank, touching dozens, perhaps hundreds of transactions. It was as if a disease had entered the bloodstream of the economy. The silent trial. Eventually, the authorities had to act. The clerk was confronted. Accounts differ on how exactly this occurred. Some records suggest he was quietly dismissed, others that he faced a more formal inquest. What is certain is that his name never became infamous, unlike highwaymen or pirates. His crime was considered too delicate, too destabilizing to be made into public theater. And that silence is telling. Authorities were less interested in satisfying public outrage than in preventing a wider panic. If the full story had been trumpeted across Europe, Amsterdam's reputation as the safest financial hub would have been destroyed. So the trial, if one can even call it that, was muted. The man disappeared into the shadows of history. A world suspended. By now, you can sense the quiet tension that gripped the city. Merchants whispered, auditors scribbled, and the council weighed every move with caution. This was not a robbery solved with a dramatic chase or a heroic capture. Instead, it was an invisible wound, one that required careful bandaging before it bled confidence dry. The bank's governors scrambled to reassure depositors, paying out balances faithfully even when it strained their reserves. Merchants, reassured by the steady continuation of business, began to relax. Slowly, trade returned to its rhythm. But the memory lingered. Picture Amsterdam in the weeks after the fraud had been quietly contained. Ships still sailed in and out of its harbors, merchant houses reopened their counting rooms, and the Grand Whistle Bank still stood as the symbol of financial reliability. On the surface, little seemed changed. But beneath that calm exterior, the very idea of money had been shaken. The crime was never about missing coins. The vault still gleamed with silver and gold, untouched. Instead, It was about faith in paper, the fragile agreement that ink and parchment could stand in for something tangible. Once a single man's forgeries had slipped into circulation, that faith cracked. The disappearance of the clerk. As for the man at the center of it all, history is silent. Unlike famous highwaymen or pirates, his name is lost to time. Whether this anonymity was deliberate or simply the consequence of careful record-keeping, we cannot know. What is clear is that he was not celebrated, not even vilified in the public imagination. He faded into obscurity, perhaps imprisoned quietly, perhaps dismissed and disgraced. The city of Amsterdam had no interest in turning him into a public spectacle. A loud trial would have meant wider panic. Silence, discretion, and removal were safer choices. This quiet disappearance tells us more about the priorities of the age than about the man himself. Stability mattered more than vengeance. Rebuilding confidence. The Whistle Bank worked hard to restore trust. They tightened their record-keeping systems, instituted more rigorous checks, and insisted on stricter oversight of clerks. From this case, a new principle began to take root, that the people writing the books must themselves be watched. It seems obvious now, but at the time it was revolutionary. Until then, clerks were trusted almost absolutely. After all, why would a man in such a minor position risk his future over ink? The answer, as the bank discovered, was simple: temptation. From then on, double-entry bookkeeping became more widely enforced. Receipts were scrutinized with greater care, and checks against clerks were built into daily business. The invisible cost. Although the fraud was contained, the damage lingered in subtle ways. Merchants remained wary of paper receipts, sometimes preferring to demand actual coin. The rhythm of commerce slowed whenever rumors surfaced, for trust once broken is slow to rebuild. In a way, the greatest victim was not a single merchant or the bank itself, but the concept of paper money. Its reputation had been dented. The fraud had shown how easily confidence could evaporate and how quickly that evaporation could spread. The city council and the Whistle Bank understood this lesson. They became ever more protective of their reputation, guarding against scandal at all costs. Future irregularities were hushed, contained before they could reach the ears of the public. A crime without a hero. Most crime stories end with a dramatic capture, a public execution, or at least a named villain to despise. But this one resists that arc. It was a crime that lived in whispers, in shadows, in the quiet pages of ledgers. It ended not with a bang, but with silence, a silence carefully maintained so that trade could continue. And perhaps that is why it is forgotten today. It does not fit our usual appetite for drama. Yet, in its own way, it was more dangerous than 1,000 highwaymen. For a man with a sword could rob a merchant of his purse, but a man with a quill could destabilize an entire city. The long-term legacy. In the centuries that followed, banks across Europe learned from Amsterdam's fragile moment. Fraud prevention became as important as guarding vaults. Systems of signatures, seals, and eventually printed notes replaced handwritten receipts. The entire architecture of modern banking security, from internal audits to anti-forgery designs on paper money, traces back to early lessons like this. What began as a quiet scandal inside a single bank ultimately shaped how the world thought about trust, money, and oversight. Reflection. As you drift on this story, consider the irony. One of the first bank robberies in history involved no robbery at all. The vault stayed locked. The coins stayed stacked. And yet, through paper alone, wealth appeared and disappeared, and confidence trembled. It leaves us with a haunting question. If money is only as strong as our trust in it, what happens when that trust is broken not by force, but by ink? Story 2. The curious case of the missing postmaster's funds. It is the middle of the 19th century, and the post office is one of the few institutions ordinary people trust implicitly. To send a letter, a payment, or even small valuables, You bring your parcel to the postmaster, a figure who stands at the center of small-town life. In villages scattered across Europe and North America, the postmaster is not just a clerk behind a counter. He is a confidant, a record keeper, and in many ways the bridge between the isolated countryside and the wider world. But trust can be dangerous, and in one seemingly ordinary town, it was trust in the postmaster that allowed a quiet crime to unfold, a crime that left both villagers and investigators bewildered when funds simply vanished. The role of the postmaster. To understand the scandal, you must first imagine the position of the 19th century postmaster. He managed not only letters but also money orders, subscription fees, and official notices. People deposited payments for everything from newspapers to tax bills. Postal clerks and carriers relied on him to keep records accurate. His office was often inside his own home, making the line between personal finances and official funds dangerously blurry. This overlap created temptation. Unlike a bank, where vaults were inspected and accounts cross-checked, the post office operated on reputation. Villagers assumed the postmaster's honesty was enough of a safeguard. After all, who would dare betray an entire town's trust? And yet, that is exactly what happened. The first signs of trouble. It began subtly. A farmer complained that his subscription to an agricultural journal never arrived, despite paying the fee months earlier. Then a widow noticed her pension payments were delayed. A few merchants whispered that payments they had sent through the post office seemed to vanish along the way. At first, no one blamed the postmaster. It was easier to blame the postal route's bad weather, lost bags, or the occasional theft by highwaymen. But as the complaints grew, a pattern emerged. The missing payments all passed through the same small-town post office. The suspicion turned slowly toward the man behind the counter. An unlikely suspect. The postmaster was well-liked, a man known for his neat handwriting and punctual habits. He had served the town for years without incident. To accuse him outright seemed almost unthinkable. But trust alone could not balance the books. Auditors from the regional postal service arrived unannounced one gray morning, carrying ledgers and official stamps. They began reviewing his accounts, line by line, comparing receipts with deposits. What they found was unsettling. Entire payments had no record of ever being forwarded. Some receipts looked altered, and in several cases, money orders appeared to have been cashed but with no trace of who had received them. It was as though the funds had been swallowed whole. A crime of paper and silence. Unlike the violence of a train robbery or the chaos of a burglary, this was a crime conducted in silence. The postmaster had simply not sent the funds onward. He had either pocketed them directly or rerouted them in ways that erased the trail. And here lies the cleverness of the scheme. Because he alone managed both the records and the deposits, there was no witness, no accomplice. The thefts were spread out, small enough to avoid immediate notice, yet together they amounted to a significant sum. For a town where every guilder or dollar mattered, this was devastating. The town reacts. Word spread quickly. Imagine being one of the villagers handing over your carefully saved coins at the counter, only to learn weeks later that your payment had never reached its destination. Some had lost tax payments, leaving them at risk of penalties. Others had lost subscriptions or small inheritances. For ordinary people, these were not abstract numbers. These were their livelihoods. At the local tavern, rumors flew. Some defended the postmaster, insisting he must have been framed. Others muttered darkly about how long he had been cheating them without their knowledge. The once quiet post office had become the center of a scandal. The investigators' dilemma. The regional postal inspectors faced a difficult question. Was this deliberate fraud or sloppy bookkeeping? In some cases, missing payments could genuinely be blamed on delays or misrouted mail. Proving intent would be harder than proving error. They pored over the ledgers late into the night, tracing each missing payment. And with each discovery, the suspicion grew that the postmaster had not merely been careless, he had been deliberate. But one mystery remained unresolved. If he had taken the money, where had it gone? There was no sign of sudden wealth. No new house, no lavish purchases. The man lived as modestly as ever, wearing the same frayed coat and walking the same muddy roads as his neighbors. So where were the funds? The postmaster's office, once a place of quiet routine, had transformed into something closer to a courtroom. The auditors sat at his desk, their fingers tracing over ledgers that now seemed to hold secrets instead of simple records. The man himself stooped, gray-haired, his spectacles perched low, shifted uneasily in his chair. For years he had been trusted without question. Now that trust had crumbled, and every stroke of his pen was evidence. The confrontation. The lead auditor began simply, "There are payments missing. Tell us where they went." The postmaster hesitated. His first explanations sounded reasonable. A bag might have been misrouted. A delay in the coach could explain the widow's pension. But as auditors produced case after case, each tied directly to his own handwriting, the excuses grew thin. When pressed about altered receipts, he deflected. "Perhaps I wrote the wrong number," he said softly, avoiding their eyes. But even he seemed to know the explanation was not enough. For the first time in decades, the town's trusted figure looked less like a public servant and more like a man with something to hide. Patterns in the records. The auditors dug deeper and a pattern began to emerge. The missing funds were not random. They clustered around certain weeks' times when larger sums passed through the office, such as tax season or harvest sales. In those weeks, discrepancies were greatest. This suggested intent, not accident. Still, there was a problem. The money itself had not been found. Unlike stolen goods, which could be seized and returned, these vanished payments seemed to dissolve into the postmaster's life without leaving a trace. A life without signs of wealth. Neighbors were baffled. If he had taken the money, why was he not living richly? His home was modest, his furniture plain. He kept no horses beyond a tired work mule. His wife dressed simply, his children wore patched clothes. This absence of evidence became a central puzzle. Some speculated he gambled it away in secret. Others whispered he had debts, perhaps to shadowy lenders or hidden misfortunes. Still others, more charitable, wondered if he had used the money to quietly support family in need. The truth remained elusive, and the more investigators searched, the more the man seemed like a hollow vessel, accused of theft but showing no signs of gain. The interrogation deepens. When simple questioning failed, the auditors shifted tactics. They presented him with names of villagers whose payments had disappeared. One by one, they listed them: the widow, the farmer, the shopkeeper. Each name was a face he saw every day on the street. At this, his composure cracked. He lowered his head, unable to answer. Was it guilt or simply shame at being accused? Some auditors believed this was the closest he came to confession. Others saw only the weight of humiliation pressing down on an innocent man. The community divides. As word of the interrogation leaked, the town split in two. One half condemned him. They believed the evidence was overwhelming: altered receipts, missing funds, evasive answers. To them, his modest lifestyle only proved his cunning, a thief clever enough not to flaunt his crime. The other half defended him. They argued that accidents happen, that clerks in distant cities might have misplaced the money, that the auditors were scapegoating a loyal servant to cover wider corruption in the postal system. In taverns and churches, arguments broke out. Was the postmaster a thief or a victim himself? The audit expands. Determined to be thorough, investigators expanded their search beyond the town. They contacted regional offices, checked accounts in nearby cities, and traced the chain of delivery. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. Some funds had indeed vanished without a trace, but others appeared to have been deposited late, in strange ways, or under unfamiliar names. The network of irregularities stretched farther than expected, raising a chilling possibility. Perhaps the postmaster was not acting alone. Could it be that he was part of a wider scheme, a link in a chain of fraud that extended beyond the village? Or was this still the work of a single man, clever enough to disguise his tracks by scattering payments? The line between incompetence and conspiracy blurred with every page of the audit. The day of reckoning came quietly. There were no dramatic arrests, no crowds jeering in the street. Instead, the postmaster was summoned to a regional court, his ledgers in hand, his spectacles perched nervously on his nose. For the man who had spent decades surrounded by papers, it must have felt cruelly fitting that it would be paper itself, the receipts, the records, the signatures that decided his fate. The trial. The courtroom was austere. Wooden benches creaked as villagers gathered, some to watch justice, others to defend a man they still considered honorable. The prosecutor laid out the evidence: missing funds, altered numbers, unexplained receipts. Piece by piece, the case was built. The defense countered with the same argument the townsfolk had debated for months, that the postmaster's life showed no sign of sudden wealth. If he is a thief, his lawyer argued, then he is the poorest thief in Christendom. The judges listened silently. They knew the case was less about one man's guilt and more about the reputation of the postal system itself. If the court declared him innocent, confidence in the auditors would falter. If they declared him guilty, the public's trust in every postmaster might weaken. It was a delicate balance. The verdict. After days of testimony, the verdict was delivered: guilty of embezzlement. The sentence was severe but not spectacular. He was dismissed from his position, ordered to repay what could be calculated, and imprisoned for a period meant as much to reassure the public as to punish the man. The courtroom murmured with mixed emotions. For some, it was justice. For others, it was scapegoating. The man who had handled their letters for decades now walked out in chains. The missing puzzle piece. And yet the money itself was never fully accounted for. Some funds were recovered in fragments, others lost entirely. No treasure chest of coins was discovered under floorboards, no hidden gambling debts revealed. The precise fate of the funds remained murky. This ambiguity haunted the town. Had he truly pocketed them all? Had some been lost in the wider network of postal routes? Was he covering for someone else higher in the chain? The unanswered questions left a shadow longer than the trial itself. The town aftermath. In the months that followed, a new postmaster was appointed, younger, stricter, with promises of cleaner bookkeeping. But the atmosphere never fully returned to normal. Every payment sent through the office was now given with hesitation. Villagers kept meticulous copies of receipts, whispering among themselves about what might happen if the new man proved no better. The old postmaster's family bore the weight of shame. His children walked with lowered heads. His wife avoided markets where whispers followed her. Though his crime had been written into the court record, his guilt remained a matter of opinion among neighbors. A system learns a lesson. The postal authorities took the case seriously. To them, the scandal was not just about a missing sum, but about the fragility of public trust. Reforms followed. Inspectors were given more power, audits became more frequent, and systems were put in place to prevent a single individual from holding unchecked control over funds. In time, this case became one of many that shaped modern accountability. It demonstrated that corruption could flourish not in grand thefts, but in the smallest offices, where one man's pen could undo the trust of hundreds. Reflection. As you imagine this, picture the postmaster's modest home, his ledgers scattered across a courtroom desk, and the townsfolk divided over his guilt. It is not a story of violence or spectacle, but of the quiet theft that creeps into ordinary life. And it leaves behind a troubling thought. If even the man trusted with your letters and savings could not be relied upon, then where, in a world built on paper and promises, could true trust ever be found? Story 3. The Railway Ticket Forgery Rings of Victorian London. It is London in the mid-19th century. The age of steam is at its height. Railway stations rise like cathedrals of iron and glass, and the great locomotives thunder across the countryside, shrinking distances in ways no one had imagined possible a generation earlier. For the first time, the ordinary shopkeeper can ride to a seaside town, and the factory worker can dream of leaving London for the green hills of the north. With this revolution came something new: tickets. Small slips of card or paper, inked with destinations, dates, and official stamps. They were the keys to this new world of movement. To own a ticket was to own a journey, and as with all things of value, tickets soon attracted the attention of criminals. The rise of the ticket. In the early years of railway expansion, tickets were handwritten by clerks at the counter. But as passenger numbers soared, railways introduced pre-printed tickets, small cardboard stubs, stamped at the station. These were simple, often little more than a name, a number, and a faint watermark. They were meant to be practical, but to a forger's eye, they were an opportunity. Imagine being a criminal in London in the 1850s, watching hundreds of passengers pass through a station each morning, tickets clutched in hand. Each ticket was worth money, but more importantly, each was accepted with little scrutiny. Conductors on trains were overwhelmed by crowds and rarely examined them closely. A well-made forgery could pass unnoticed. And so, quietly, the railway ticket forgery rings were born. The first forgeries. The earliest attempts were crude. Criminals used scraps of paper, hand-drawn stamps, and copied numbers. Many were caught quickly. A conductor would notice the wrong color ink, or a station clerk would spot handwriting that didn't match official receipts. But others were more ambitious. Skilled printers, some formerly employed in legitimate businesses, turned their presses to illegal work. They acquired blank card stock, studied official tickets, and began to replicate the fonts, colors, and stamps with alarming accuracy. By the 1860s, counterfeit tickets were circulating widely enough that railway companies began to panic. It was not just about lost revenue. It was about trust. If passengers doubted the system, if clerks couldn't tell real from fake, the entire ticketing process might collapse. The forgery rings. Unlike lone pickpockets or petty thieves, ticket forgery became an organized business. Small gangs operated across London, often centered in poor districts near the docks or railway lines. One gang might have a printer producing blank cards. Another had men skilled in stamping seals. Runners distributed the tickets to petty criminals, who sold them at taverns for a fraction of the official price. For the working poor, the temptation was strong. A legitimate ticket to Brighton might cost several shillings. A counterfeit could be bought for half the price. Many turned a blind eye to the source, telling themselves it was harmless. After all, the train ride was the same, whether the ticket was genuine or forged. But to the railway companies, the losses mounted. Tens of thousands of pounds vanished each year into the underground trade. Detectives enter the scene. By the late Victorian era, private detectives employed by the railway companies themselves were hunting the forgers. These men, often retired policemen, blended into crowds at stations, quietly observing suspicious exchanges. They tracked forged tickets back to sellers and sellers back to the printers. Raids on print shops revealed presses, ink plates, and stacks of half-finished tickets. But each time one ring was broken, another appeared. The profits were simply too good, the risks too low. Even the courts struggled. Was a forged ticket worth the same as the fare it replaced, or was it mere paper? Some judges treated it as petty fraud. Others considered it a serious crime against the public order. Sentences varied wildly. a crime for the ordinary man. What makes these forgery rings unusual is how ordinary they were. They did not rely on violence, nor did they target the wealthy alone. They thrived because they served demand. The public itself, hungry for cheap fares, became willing customers. To hold a forged ticket was to participate in a crime, but for many, it felt victimless. The railway was vast, impersonal, and rich. Who would be harmed by one small counterfeit stub? And yet in aggregate, the harm was enormous. The whisper of suspicion. Conductors and clerks became increasingly wary. Passengers were questioned more closely. Tickets were held up to the light, examined for faint differences in ink. Innocent travelers sometimes found themselves accused of forgery, caught in the tightening net of suspicion. The railway, once a symbol of freedom and ease, became tinged with anxiety. Every ticket was now a potential lie. The year is 1873, and the London and South Coast Railway is losing thousands of pounds each month to counterfeit tickets. The directors are furious. Conductors report entire compartments filled with passengers whose tickets prove worthless once examined closely. Railway revenues shrink, while the public begins to grumble about fare increases and intrusive inspections. It is clear the forgery rings have grown too bold. Something must be done. The railway detectives. Unlike today, where fraud is investigated by government agencies, Victorian railway companies often took justice into their own hands. They hired private detectives, men who knew the criminal underworld of London. Some were retired constables, others streetwise informants. Their task was difficult. Forged tickets looked almost identical to the real thing. A quick glance at a crowded station counter was not enough, so detectives learned to watch not just the tickets but the people. They lingered in taverns where laborers gathered, listening for whispers of cheap fares. They followed men loitering at station entrances, offering small cardboard stubs for a few shillings. They tracked purchases back through shadowy alleys to the print shops where the real work took place. Raids on the print shops. One of the most dramatic breakthroughs came when detectives raided a small printer's workshop in Clerkenwell. The shopfront looked ordinary enough, posters and pamphlets hung in the window. But in the back room, presses clattered late into the night, stamping out not handbills but perfect imitations of Brighton railway tickets. Stacks of cards were discovered, some blank, some half-finished, others stamped with convincing seals. Ironically, the printer had once been employed by a railway contractor. His skills, once used to produce legitimate tickets, had been turned to crime. He was arrested, but his conviction did little to stop the wider problem. Other shops were already operating in Bermondsey, Whitechapel, and Camden. Each raid shut down one ring, but like weeds in a neglected garden, new ones sprouted immediately. The forger's methods. By the 1880s, forgery had become a sophisticated craft. Criminals studied genuine tickets under magnifying glasses, replicating fonts and watermarks with remarkable precision. Some forged tickets bore serial numbers copied from legitimate stubs, making them harder to detect. Others were pressed on cardstock, so convincing that only the most careful conductor could spot the difference. Even the stamp's tiny circles of ink meant to prove authenticity were copied with homemade seals. A forged ticket might lack only the faintest detail, visible only if held up to the gaslight at just the right angle. The detectives, frustrated, realized they were caught in a game of endless imitation. Every improvement in ticket design was soon matched by the forgers. The public's role. Perhaps the most unsettling truth was that the forgery trade thrived because of public demand. A working man, facing a day's wages just to ride to Brighton with his family, might find the lure of a counterfeit ticket irresistible. Taverns became informal markets. A man with a forged ticket could approach a stranger and whisper, "half fare for the same journey." Many buyers knew they were purchasing fakes, others convinced themselves It was merely surplus stock from the railway. The crime, in other words, depended not only on criminals, but on ordinary people willing to participate. A breakthrough in Brighton. In 1885, a breakthrough came when a conductor on the Brighton line noticed something odd. A group of passengers handed over tickets that looked identical. Serial numbers, which should have been unique, repeated across several stubs. The discovery led investigators back to a single seller, then to his supplier, and finally to a print shop where hundreds of duplicates were being churned out. The case made headlines, and the press seized on it as proof of the growing audacity of the forgery rings. For the first time, the public began to see ticket forgery not as a harmless shortcut, but as a criminal enterprise undermining the very railways they depended on. The courts respond. In response, courts began to hand down harsher sentences. Where once a forger might have received a fine or a few months in prison, now they faced years of hard labor. Judges warned that the crime, though bloodless, was as damaging as theft on the highway. Railway companies, eager to protect their profits, pressed for legislation to treat forgery with the seriousness of counterfeiting coin. Parliament debated reforms, and new measures were introduced to strengthen penalties. And yet, even with the threat of prison looming, the forgeries continued. The profits were too tempting, the demand too steady. By the 1890s, the railway ticket forgery rings had grown from a nuisance into a serious threat. Railway directors, faced with mounting losses, knew they could not simply rely on more raids and harsher sentences. The system itself had to change. The solution would not come from the courts alone, but from innovation. The birth of secure tickets. Railway companies began to experiment with new methods of printing. Instead of plain cardstock, tickets were printed with unique colors, patterns, and serial sequences harder to duplicate. Some were embossed with raised lettering that forgers' cheap presses could not replicate. They also introduced mechanical ticket machines, invented by Thomas Edmondson. These machines cut and printed standardized tickets in uniform sizes, making it harder for counterfeiters to replicate the exact look and feel. A genuine Edmondson ticket was sturdier, thicker, and carried numbers that were carefully tracked. For the first time, the balance began to shift. The decline of the rings. As tickets became more complex, the forgery rings found it harder to keep pace. Raids still occurred, but each time fewer forged tickets were seized. By the turn of the century, ticket forgery had not vanished, but it had diminished, pushed to the margins by technology. Still, the rings did not disappear overnight. In poorer districts, counterfeit tickets remained part of the underground economy. Every few years, a new case surfaced. A printer caught with a stack of fakes, a tavern raided for selling cheap stubs. But the scale was no longer enough to terrify the railway companies. The human cost. For those caught in the trade, punishment was harsh. Men who once saw themselves as clever entrepreneurs, printers selling tickets instead of pamphlets, found themselves sentenced to years of hard labor. Sellers, often petty thieves drawn by quick profit, disappeared into prisons. But the wider cost was borne by the working poor. For every family tempted by a half-price counterfeit ticket, there was the risk of discovery, humiliation, and arrest. Entire households carried the shame of being linked to ticket cheats. What began as an opportunity for affordable travel often ended in ruin. Lessons for the railways. The forgery rings left a permanent mark on the railway industry. They forced companies to think not only about tracks, locomotives, and stations, but about the integrity of their paper systems. It was one of the first great lessons in financial security of the modern era. That crime did not always come with violence, but sometimes with the quiet scratch of a printing press. From these cases came reforms that shaped the future. Tickets became standardized, serialized, and machine-printed. Inspections grew stricter, and most importantly, the public came to understand that what seemed like a harmless counterfeit was, in fact, an attack on the very system they relied upon. Reflection. As you imagine those crowded Victorian stations, filled with the hiss of steam and the bustle of passengers, picture too the quiet exchanges in taverns, the secret presses in back rooms, and the detectives scanning the crowds for suspicious tickets. The story of the railway ticket forgery rings is not one of grand heists or violent robberies, but of ordinary crimes multiplied into something vast. It is a reminder that modernity itself, the trains, the timetables, the paper tickets, could be both opportunity and vulnerability. And it leaves us with a question that lingers long after the smoke of the locomotives has cleared. If progress depends on systems of paper, machines, and trust, then will crime always be one step behind or one step ahead? Story 4. The Silent Poisoner, a small-town apothecary's secret trade. It is the mid-1800s, and in the corner of a modest market town stands the apothecary's shop. The shelves are lined with glass jars filled with powders, tinctures, and herbs. The air smells faintly of camphor and dried lavender. Behind the counter works the apothecary, a man who, in many ways, holds the town's health in his hands. In an age before modern pharmacies, before strict medical licensing, the apothecary is both healer and businessman. He sells tonics for coughs, powders for pain, and drafts for sleepless nights. To the villagers, he is trusted, indispensable. And yet, hidden within those bottles and powders are substances that can heal in one dose and kill in another. This is the world in which one quiet figure built a reputation not only as a dispenser of medicine, but as a silent poisoner. The apothecary's power. Unlike today's carefully regulated pharmacists, the 19th-century apothecary had broad freedom. He could prepare his own mixtures, combine ingredients, and sell remedies with little oversight. Customers rarely questioned what they were given. On his shelves sat opium, arsenic, strychnine, belladonna, substances we now recognize as deadly poisons, but which were then used in small doses for legitimate medical purposes. Arsenic was prescribed for skin conditions, strychnine for nerve disorders, opium for pain and sleeplessness. The line between cure and poison was razor-thin, and it was a line the apothecary could cross at will. The first deaths. The first suspicious death was written off as misfortune. A farmer's wife, long ill, passed after taking a tonic prescribed for her stomach pains. The town mourned, but no one questioned the apothecary. After all, he had been the one trying to cure her. But then a second death followed. A young clerk, struck down suddenly after a dose of nerve medicine. And then a third, an elderly pensioner who had purchased a sleeping draught. Each case, standing alone, seemed natural enough. Illness was common. Death came quickly in those days, but whispers began to spread. How was it that so many of the dead had visited the apothecary shortly before their passing? The suspicion grows. Neighbors began to murmur in taverns and church pews. Was the apothecary careless? Were his powders mixed too strongly, his drafts too potent? Or was there something darker at work, something deliberate? Some pointed to his financial troubles. Despite his respected position, the apothecary had debts. A death or two in the right family could bring him payments for outstanding bills or secure him inheritances through backroom dealings. Others whispered of jealousy. A merchant who died had once quarreled with him over land. A clerk had owed him money. Was the apothecary quietly using his shop not as a place of healing, but as a weapon? Investigators arrive. In time, regional authorities grew uneasy. Reports of unusual deaths in the small town reached their ears. An inquest was ordered. The apothecary's shop, once seen as a place of remedies, was suddenly treated as a scene of suspicion. Inspectors examined his shelves. They found arsenic in quantities larger than seemed necessary, bottles of laudanum mixed far stronger than standard, and powders stored without clear labeling. To modern eyes, it would be obvious malpractice, but even in his own day, the lack of caution seemed deliberate. The townsfolk, watching from the street as inspectors carried jars out of the shop, felt a chill. The man they had trusted for years, the man who had sold them medicine for their children, and their elderly might have been selling death instead. The dilemma of proof. And yet suspicion was not proof. Poisons left little trace. Autopsies were crude, chemical tests unreliable. It was possible that the apothecary had simply been careless, his victims unlucky. But then, as investigators compared case after case, a troubling pattern emerged. The deaths clustered around those who had quarreled with him, those who owed him money, or those whose passing conveniently benefited his position. It seemed less like accident, more like design. The inquest began in a cramped town hall, its benches crowded with villagers who had once come to the apothecary for cures, and who now gathered to see whether he would be declared a killer. The atmosphere was hushed, uneasy. This was no ordinary trial of theft or brawling. This was the question of whether the man trusted with their health had betrayed them in the most intimate way possible. Testimonies of the bereaved. One by one, witnesses stepped forward. A grieving husband described how his wife had fallen violently ill after drinking a tonic purchased for her stomach cramps. A young apprentice recounted how his master collapsed suddenly, clutching his chest, after swallowing a nerve powder. The stories shared a haunting similarity: sudden illness, swift decline, and bottles bearing the apothecary's label. The apothecary, sitting stiffly before the magistrates, adjusted his spectacles but said little. He claimed his mixtures were standard, his dosages safe. Illness, he argued, was unpredictable. Death came to all. But the families were not convinced. The apothecary's ledgers. Investigators turned next to his ledgers. At first glance, they appeared orderly, neat columns of names, purchases, and payments. But on closer inspection, oddities emerged. Certain names appeared repeatedly, always linked to the strongest preparations, bottles marked with extra tinctures, powders mixed at higher concentrations. Several of those names now belonged to the dead. And there were financial details. Debts marked settled shortly after a customer's death. Unusual notations suggesting barter or favors exchanged in place of payment. It was not proof, but it was enough to cast deeper suspicion. The chemical tests. Forensic science in the 19th century was crude, but arsenic had one advantage. It left traces that could sometimes be detected. Investigators exhumed 2 bodies and carried out tests using the Marsh method, a relatively new chemical process that could reveal arsenic through the formation of metallic stains. The results were chilling. Both bodies showed clear signs of arsenic poisoning. The apothecary insisted that arsenic was a common medicine, used in small doses for legitimate treatment. He denied giving more than was safe, but the amounts discovered were far beyond any reasonable prescription. The pattern of motive. With poison confirmed, investigators returned to motive. They noted that one victim had owed him money, another had disputed land boundaries, another had insulted him publicly. It seemed as though personal slights, debts, and grudges aligned eerily with the deaths. Neighbors who had once defended him began to murmur differently. The quiet man behind the counter, they whispered, had long carried himself with pride, even arrogance. Perhaps these deaths were not random at all, but carefully chosen punishments. A village divided. Still, some villagers defended him. They argued that illness was rampant in those years, that cholera and fevers struck down many without explanation. They suggested the investigators were eager for a villain and had decided the apothecary must be guilty before the inquiry even began. In taverns, arguments broke out. Was he a healer wrongly accused, or a murderer hiding in plain sight? The town was no longer united in grief, but divided by suspicion. The apothecary's silence. When pressed directly in the inquest, the apothecary refused to admit wrongdoing. He spoke only to repeat that his medicines were legitimate, that any deaths were due to frailty, not fraud. But his silence was damning. He did not rage or protest. He did not weep or beg. He sat quietly, calmly, as if certain that no one could truly prove him guilty. And perhaps, in a sense, he was right. Without modern forensic methods, evidence remained circumstantial. Even the chemical traces could not prove intent, only presence. The trial opened in the county assizes, a larger and more formal setting than the town inquest. Newspapers carried the story beyond the village, and by the time the apothecary stood in the dock, his name had become a symbol of betrayal. A healer turned killer, a man of science accused of using knowledge not for cures, but for control over life and death. The prosecution's case. The prosecutor painted a chilling portrait, a man who, under the guise of medicine, administered death. He pointed to the chemical tests, which confirmed lethal quantities of arsenic in at least 2 bodies. He presented ledgers where debts vanished conveniently after a customer's sudden death. He emphasized the pattern: too many deaths, too closely linked, too consistent to be coincidence. Poison, he declared, is the weapon of the coward. And here we have a man who used it not once, not twice, but repeatedly, hiding behind his bottles and powders while his neighbors trusted him with their very lives. The defense's struggle. The defense argued desperately. They pointed to the common use of arsenic in medicine at the time, insisting that overdoses could be accidental. They questioned the reliability of forensic methods, calling the tests unproven and subject to error. They emphasized the lack of direct evidence. No one had seen him administer poison with malicious intent. Most of all, they leaned on his reputation. For decades, the apothecary had been a fixture of the town, trusted by all. Could such a man truly be a serial poisoner? But reputation, once cracked, is difficult to repair. The public's judgment. Outside the courtroom, the public had already decided. The case stirred deep fears. In an age when few understood chemistry and most relied blindly on apothecaries for medicine, the thought that those medicines might conceal death was horrifying. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, whispering that justice must be done. Mothers clutched their children tighter, husbands eyed medicine bottles with suspicion. The apothecary was no longer just one man on trial. He was a symbol of how vulnerable they all were. The verdict. The jury returned after hours of deliberation. Their decision: guilty of murder by poison. The apothecary stood silent as the sentence was read. He would be hanged, the same fate as common thieves and murderers. His shop would be shuttered, his possessions sold, his name forever stained. The execution was carried out quietly but firmly. There was no public spectacle. Officials feared that dramatizing the event might spread panic about the safety of medicine itself, but word traveled fast nonetheless. Aftermath for the town. In the weeks that followed, the town moved uneasily. Families threw away bottles purchased from his shop. Some refused medicines altogether, fearful that others might be no safer. The new apothecary, appointed quickly by the county, found himself under constant scrutiny. Every draft, every powder was examined with suspicion. It would take years for trust to return. A legacy in medicine. The case became a cautionary tale for medical authorities. If an apothecary could use poisons so freely, stronger regulations were needed. Across Britain and Europe, new laws tightened control of arsenic, opium, and other dangerous substances. Bottles required clearer labeling. Apothecaries faced stricter licensing. The silent poisoner had, in his way, forced the birth of modern pharmacy regulation. Reflection. Imagine again those shelves of glass bottles, each holding powders of white, crystals of green, tinctures of amber. To the villagers, they once represented healing, but after the trial, they would forever be remembered as tools of betrayal. And the thought lingers. When medicine depends on trust, how can you ever be certain that what heals in one dose will not kill in the next? Story 5. The Fraudulent Lighthouse Keepers of Nova Scotia. The coast of Nova Scotia in the 19th century was a place of peril as much as beauty. Its jagged rocks and fierce Atlantic storms made it one of the most dangerous stretches of water for sailors. To guard against disaster, lighthouses were built, their steady beams promising safe passage to mariners navigating the fog and waves. The lighthouse keeper was entrusted with a sacred duty, to keep the lamp burning no matter the hour, no matter the storm. His task was more than employment. It was a lifeline for sailors, merchants, and fishermen whose lives depended on that distant light. And yet, in certain lonely stations along the coast, that trust was quietly betrayed. What appeared to the outside world as a faithful beacon was, in reality, the stage for fraud, corruption, and neglect. The men charged with saving lives sometimes turned the post into a scheme for personal gain. The keeper's role. To understand the scandal, you must first imagine the life of a lighthouse keeper. He and his family lived in near isolation, stationed miles from the nearest village, supplied only intermittently by boats. His daily work was unending, trimming wicks, polishing glass lenses, hauling oil, and ensuring the lamp burned through long nights. The government paid him a modest wage and provided oil and supplies, carefully calculated to last until the next delivery. In theory, every drop of oil, every replacement wick was accounted for. But isolation offered opportunity. Few ever inspected the lighthouse directly, and the keeper's word was often taken at face value. The first rumors. Sailors began to whisper of lights that burned dimmer than they should, or of nights when the lamp seemed not to shine at all. A few ships reported near disasters, claiming they saw no beacon where one should have been. At first, these stories were dismissed as the result of fog or storm. But then merchants noticed a stranger pattern: barrels of lamp oil meant for lighthouses turning up for sale in nearby towns. The very fuel that should have kept the lamps burning was instead lighting the hearths and lamps of households inland. Where had it come from? Suspicion turned quickly to the keepers. A crime of oil and ledgers. The fraud was simple but effective. Lighthouse keepers received more oil than they truly needed if they practiced economy, trimming wicks shorter, letting the lamps burn lower, or failing to light them at all on clear nights. The saved oil could then be sold quietly to traders or townsfolk. Some keepers went further, falsifying their reports, claiming storms had forced them to burn more oil than usual, or that lenses had required costly repairs. In reality, the excess oil flowed into private barrels, and the repairs were exaggerated for inflated reimbursement. The fraud was difficult to prove. To sailors, a dim light might be mistaken for weather. To officials, a few extra barrels missing from a delivery seemed insignificant against the vast supply chain. But over time, the evidence mounted. Lives at risk. This was no victimless crime. Every drop of oil sold for private profit meant a weaker lamp at sea. A dim or absent light could mean disaster on the rocks. Indeed, during this period, several shipwrecks occurred alarmingly close to lighthouses later suspected of fraud. Families of drowned sailors wrote bitter letters to officials, accusing keepers of negligence. Merchants raged over lost cargo. Each tragedy intensified the scrutiny, until the government could no longer ignore the whispers. The inspectors arrive. Finally, inspectors were dispatched. They arrived unannounced by boat, climbing the cliffs to reach the lighthouses. What they found was damning. Some lamps were poorly maintained, their lenses clouded with soot. Barrels of oil stood half-empty despite recent deliveries. In one case, inspectors even discovered a hidden stash of oil marked with government seals, clearly intended for resale. The keepers offered excuses. Storms had burned extra oil, rats had gnawed holes in barrels, accidents had wasted supplies. But the inspectors were not convinced. Reports were filed, names were noted, and charges of fraud were prepared. The scandal of the lighthouses spread faster than the fog that rolled off the Atlantic. By the 1870s, rumors of fraudulent keepers had reached government offices in Halifax, and inspectors were under orders to tighten their watch. The reports they filed read like indictments: missing oil, falsified logs, and lights that burned too faintly to guide even the closest ships. For the first time, the lonely and romantic image of the lighthouse keeper was replaced by suspicion that the very men meant to guard the coast had endangered it for profit. The inspector's findings. In one case, an inspector discovered that a lighthouse reported to have burned steadily for weeks had, in fact, been left dark on several clear nights. Logs had been fabricated, entries copied in neat handwriting but impossible to match with weather records. In another, a keeper claimed storms had consumed vast amounts of oil. Yet the logs of nearby fishing villages recorded calm seas and fair skies. When inspectors compared the two records, the fraud became obvious. More damning still were the barrels themselves. Several bore government markings but had been scraped and sanded to hide them. They were found stacked behind taverns and in the back rooms of shops, proof that lighthouse oil had been sold into private hands. The role of the community. The fraud could not have thrived without complicity. Local merchants benefited from the cheap oil, which burned longer and steadier than ordinary supplies. Fishermen bought it for their boats, households for their lamps. Many looked the other way, convincing themselves the keepers deserved a little extra for their lonely service. But when wrecks occurred, and they did, with tragic regularity, guilt began to spread. Families of drowned sailors asked bitterly whether their loved ones had died not because of storms, but because of greed. Suddenly, townsfolk who once bought oil quietly from keepers now found themselves accused of abetting death. A case that stirred the courts. One case in particular brought the issue into sharp relief. In 1875, a ship carrying timber from New Brunswick struck rocks near a lighthouse suspected of neglect. Survivors swore they saw no light on the night of the wreck, though the keeper insisted he had tended it faithfully. An inquiry was launched. Witnesses testified that barrels of oil from the lighthouse had been seen in town days before. The keeper was accused not only of fraud, but of manslaughter. His dimmed light, the court argued, had directly led to the wreck and the deaths that followed. Though the trial dragged on for months, the outcome set a precedent. Fraud at a lighthouse was no longer merely financial misconduct. It could be a crime of life and death. The public backlash. News of these scandals made their way into newspapers across the Maritimes. Editorials railed against the betrayal of the beacon. Sailors' unions demanded stricter oversight, and merchants petitioned the government for reform. The lighthouse keeper, once celebrated in poems and paintings as the lonely guardian of the coast, now became a figure of suspicion. His lamp was no longer just a symbol of safety, but of potential betrayal. For families living in coastal villages, the betrayal was personal. The very man who watched the seas was meant to watch over their fathers, brothers, and sons. To learn that he might have sold oil while ships went dark was more than scandal, it was heartbreak. Government response. The authorities could not ignore the outrage. By the late 19th century, reforms were underway. Detailed audits were introduced, inspectors made unannounced visits, and keepers were rotated more frequently to prevent long-term corruption with local merchants. In some places, multiple keepers were stationed together, ensuring one could watch the other. No longer could a man hide his negligence behind isolation. Still, even with reforms, the whispers persisted. Could every light truly be trusted? Was every beacon burning honestly? By the late 19th century, the scandals of the Nova Scotia lighthouses had left their mark. What began as whispers of dim lights and missing oil had grown into court cases, public outrage, and a reckoning for an institution once considered above reproach. The government, pressed by both merchants and grieving families, realized that leaving lighthouse keepers unchecked was no longer possible. Lives and trade depended too heavily on those flickering lamps in the storm. The trials of the keepers. Several lighthouse keepers across the coast were formally charged with fraud, neglect of duty, and in the most damning cases, manslaughter. The trials were somber affairs. Unlike the dramatic spectacles of murder cases in crowded cities, these hearings carried a quieter, grimmer weight. Survivors of wrecks testified to seeing no light on the nights of disaster. Inspectors presented barrels of oil, their government markings clumsily scratched away. Some keepers protested innocence, claiming storms or faulty equipment were to blame. Others admitted to saving oil, but insisted it was common practice, a way to supplement meager wages. Few, however, escaped the judgment that their negligence had cost lives. Sentences ranged from fines to imprisonment. A handful of keepers were dismissed in disgrace, their families forced to leave the isolated stations they had long called home. The wider reforms. The scandals forced sweeping reforms across the lighthouse system, not only in Nova Scotia, but throughout the Canadian Maritimes. Auditing and supply control. Deliveries of oil and supplies were now logged with precision, and inspectors conducted surprise checks to ensure no barrels were missing. Keeper rotation. Men were rotated between stations to prevent long-term ties with local merchants who might tempt them into resale schemes. Multiple staff. Where possible, stations were assigned more than one keeper, ensuring that no single individual could act without oversight. Technological innovation. In time, the introduction of new fuels and automated mechanisms reduced dependence on individual keepers' honesty. These reforms restored confidence, but not without leaving scars on the collective memory. The community's memory. For coastal towns, the betrayal of the lighthouse keepers lingered like a salt sting. Families of lost sailors never forgot. Even after reforms, many mariners looked anxiously toward the shore on dark nights, wondering whether the light ahead burned bright enough or at all. In some villages, the children of disgraced keepers bore the weight of shame for generations. They were whispered about in markets and churches, reminders of a time when greed had darkened the beacons. The keeper's lonely temptation. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of these cases is the reminder of human frailty. The lighthouse keeper's life was isolated, his pay meager, his labor endless. Alone on the cliffs with barrels of valuable oil at hand, temptation grew like a shadow. Some resisted, others faltered. It was not grand theft, nor violent crime. It was small decisions, a few pints of oil saved here, a dimmer lamp lit there that accumulated into disaster. Reflection. The story of the fraudulent lighthouse keepers is not just about barrels of oil or missing funds. It is about trust, the fragile trust between those at sea and those on land, between men who risked their lives on the water and the keepers who promised them safe passage. And it leaves behind a question that echoes as steadily as the sea itself. When survival depends on a single light in the darkness, what happens when the man tending that light chooses profit over duty? Story 6. The Forgotten Cold Case of the Vanishing Schoolmaster. It was a small town in the late 19th century, the kind of place where every neighbor knew each other's habits and where the schoolhouse bell was one of the few daily markers of time. The man who rang that bell, who taught arithmetic and penmanship to generations of children, was the schoolmaster, a figure of authority, routine, and predictability. And yet one autumn morning that predictability fractured. The schoolmaster locked his classroom door, left his modest cottage, and walked out into the world. He was never seen again. The schoolmaster's life. To understand the impact of his disappearance, you must first imagine his life. He was not wealthy, few teachers of the era were, but he carried a quiet dignity. His wages came from local subscriptions and the modest support of the county. He lived simply, with shelves of books and a desk littered with papers. By all accounts, he was steady, punctual, and sober. Each morning he appeared at the schoolhouse. Each evening he returned home. He lived alone, his company mostly the children he taught and the parents who occasionally visited to check on lessons. There was little in his life to suggest drama, which is why his vanishing struck the town like thunder. The morning of the disappearance. On the day he vanished, he was seen by several people. A shopkeeper remembered him purchasing ink. A farmer recalled passing him on the road, where the schoolmaster nodded politely. Later, a group of children gathered at the schoolhouse waited in vain for the bell to ring. By noon, parents began to worry. When the door to his cottage was opened, they found nothing disturbed. His bed was neatly made, his books in their places, his clothing folded. Only one coat was missing, and the boots he had worn that morning. There was no note, no sign of struggle, simply absence. The first suspicions. In a small community, speculation filled the void. Some whispered that he had debts and had fled. Others muttered that he had grown weary of isolation and sought a new life elsewhere. A darker rumor suggested foul play, that he had met with violence on the road and been hidden away by robbers or enemies. But who could hate the schoolmaster? He was not a man of quarrels, not wealthy enough to tempt thieves. His only possessions of value were books and a pocket watch. Still, the absence gnawed. A man so fixed in routine did not simply walk away. The search. Neighbors organized a search. They combed the fields, the woods, and the nearby riverbanks. They knocked on farmhouse doors and asked travelers if they had seen him on the road. Weeks passed, and still no trace. Not a body, not a piece of clothing, not a single clue that could explain where he had gone. The authorities, lacking leads, filed the case away. In those days, without forensic tools or modern communication, a man could vanish and leave nothing behind but questions. The schoolhouse without a master. The greatest impact fell on the children. The schoolhouse stood silent for months, its bell unused, its lessons unfinished. Parents grumbled. The county eventually hired a replacement, but the memory of the missing man lingered. For the children who had once sat at his desk, his sudden disappearance remained a story they carried into adulthood. Some claimed they dreamed of him, standing in the woods or walking the fields at dusk. Others swore they saw him in distant towns, a fleeting glimpse of a familiar face. None of these sightings were ever confirmed. A mystery without an ending. Years passed, and the missing schoolmaster became a story told in hushed tones. New generations heard of him as a cautionary tale, the man who left one morning and was never seen again. Some called him a coward, others a victim. To most, he was simply a mystery, an ordinary man whose life ended not with death, but with absence. Weeks turned into months, and the mystery of the missing schoolmaster gnawed at the town like a loose tooth. In the absence of answers, rumors multiplied. The villagers, who had once thought of him as little more than a quiet, studious man, now dissected every detail of his life for signs of secrets they might have missed. The debt theory. The first explanation clung stubbornly to the idea of debt. A few merchants whispered that the schoolmaster had owed them small sums for ink, candles, or coal, but none could point to a debt large enough to justify flight. His wages were modest but steady, his lifestyle frugal. If he had left to escape creditors, it was an escape from trifles, not ruin. And yet, the debt theory lingered, for it was the most plausible to those unwilling to believe darker alternatives. The romantic rumors. Soon, gossip took another turn. Perhaps a woman was involved. Though never married, the schoolmaster had been polite with widows, kind to daughters, attentive in church pews. A rumor spread that he had been seen walking with a young woman on a back lane weeks before his disappearance. Others swore he had written secret letters. No evidence was ever produced. No woman ever confessed. But in a village hungry for explanations, the idea of romance offered both scandal and drama. It suggested he had not vanished into violence, but into passion, a man carried off by the lure of love. The river search. As winter came, authorities feared the most practical explanation, that he had slipped, drowned, and been carried off by the river's current. Searchers dragged the water, their hooks snagging on roots and stones, but no body surfaced. In the 19th century, a drowned man often revealed himself weeks later, carried ashore by the tide. But months passed, and the river gave up nothing. This absence of a body deepened the mystery. If he had drowned, where was he? The stranger sightings. Then came the sightings. A farmer traveling to a market town swore he had seen the schoolmaster boarding a stagecoach. A sailor insisted he spotted him in Halifax, carrying a bag and walking with haste. Each report carried the weight of possibility, but none were confirmed. The further the stories spread, the more they became folklore. Perhaps he had gone abroad, some said. Perhaps he had reinvented himself under another name, far from the village that knew him too well. And with every unconfirmed sighting, the question grew sharper. Had the schoolmaster chosen to vanish? The darker theory. Not everyone believed in flight. Some whispered of foul play. The schoolmaster, quiet as he was, might have been victim of a robbery on the road. A group of laborers were said to have quarreled with him weeks earlier. A farmer claimed he had heard shouts near the woods the very night he vanished. But searches turned up nothing. No blood, no discarded possessions, no body buried in shallow ground. If there had been violence, it was violence hidden with care. A town grows weary. By spring, the villagers' energy for searching waned. New routines filled their days, and the new schoolmaster rang the bell as though the old one had never existed. For many, it was easier to fold the mystery into silence. But for others, the children who had once recited lessons at his desk, the families who remembered him as a figure of stability, the absence continued to haunt. At night, some swore they heard his voice in dreams, calling roll or reading from a book. The case, unsolved, slipped into the realm of ghost stories. By the turn of the century, the missing schoolmaster had faded from memory for many. The children he once taught had grown into adults with children of their own. The town itself had changed. New roads, new shops, a larger railway line that brought strangers through more frequently. But for some, the case never left. His absence became a shadow that colored their view of the world. The official record. In the county archives, his disappearance was recorded in brief. Schoolmaster missing since October, presumed dead. No remains recovered. It was a bureaucratic line, clinical and detached, meant to close a file rather than answer a question. But to those who remembered him, that line was unsatisfactory. How could a life be reduced to a presumption? Where was the closure for the pupils who still spoke his name? The families who remembered. Oral history kept him alive more than documents did. Families passed down the tale, reshaping it with every retelling. To some, he had been a tragic figure, overworked and unappreciated, who walked into the horizon to start anew. To others, he had been a victim of crime, silenced by a hand stronger than his own. Children grew up hearing the story as if it were a bedtime tale. Don't wander off alone, or you might vanish like the schoolmaster. In this way, he became less a man than a cautionary figure. Later investigations. Decades later, amateur historians and local detectives revisited the case. With modern eyes, they asked, might he have been suffering from melancholy, what we would now call depression? Might he have taken his own life in a way that left no trace? Or perhaps, they wondered, he had been one of the countless men who abandoned small-town lives to disappear into cities, ports, or foreign colonies, slipping into anonymity among strangers. These theories offered explanations, but none offered certainty. The symbol of a missing man. The story of the missing schoolmaster lingered not because of what was known, But because of what was not, he left behind no crime scene, no weapon, no last words, only questions. And in that silence, the community was forced to confront its own unease, that the safety of routine was an illusion, that even the most predictable lives could vanish into nothingness. Reflections on closure. In crime stories, we often seek resolution and arrest, a trial, a verdict. But in this case, the absence of answers was the story. The schoolmaster's disappearance reminded the town, and all who later read of it, that some mysteries are destined to remain unsolved. For the families, the lack of closure was a wound. For the children, it was a lingering memory of a teacher who began a lesson one day but never finished it. For posterity, it was a reminder that history is as much about what is missing as what is preserved. Story 7. The Great Butter Heist, Food Fraud in 19th Century Europe. In the 19th century, food was wealth. Grain, milk, meat, and butter were not just meals. They were currency, survival, and trade. Among these, butter held a special place. It was not merely a kitchen staple, it was a symbol of prosperity, a product whose quality and freshness could mean the difference between health and illness, survival and hunger. But butter was also expensive. Made from cream, requiring fresh milk and careful churning, it was labor-intensive and highly perishable. In cities, where rural farms were distant, butter was sold at prices many working families struggled to afford. That imbalance, high demand, high cost, and fragile supply created the perfect opportunity for crime. And so began one of Europe's strangest scandals, the widespread fraud of butter. The substitution game. At first, the fraud was simple. Traders mixed butter with cheaper fats, stretching it further. Animal tallow, lard, or even mashed potatoes found their way into the churn. For unsuspecting buyers, the difference was masked with salt or coloring. But as industrialization advanced, fraud grew more sophisticated. Chemists discovered that oils from cottonseed and other sources could be manipulated into a substance that resembled butter. When chilled, it spread almost like the real thing. To the working-class palate, already accustomed to coarse bread and thin broth, the imitation could pass. This was the birth of margarine, though at the time, it was less an honest alternative than a shadowy deception. The heist in plain sight. Unlike bank robberies or jewel thefts, the butter crimes did not occur in the dead of night. They happened in daylight, in shops, markets, and kitchens. The theft was not of coins or goods, but of trust. Families thought they were buying nourishment, only to discover later that they had been sold something adulterated, sometimes dangerously so. Cases emerged where butter was bulked with chalk, clay, or even ground-up animal bones. Each adulteration increased profit margins, but also raised the risk of illness. For those already weakened by poverty, bad butter could be devastating. The economic stakes. The fraud did more than sicken families. It shook markets. Genuine dairy farmers, who labored for every pat of butter, found themselves undercut by cheaper substitutes. Their livelihoods faltered as urban demand shifted toward vendors who could sell imitation products at lower prices. Farmers cried out for government intervention, insisting that the fraud was not only immoral but destructive to rural economies. Politicians, pressured by both lobbyists and public health concerns, soon found themselves forced into action. A crime without borders. What made the butter scandal particularly shocking was its scale. Unlike a single forgery or local swindle, butter fraud crossed borders. It spread through France, Germany, Britain, and beyond, tied to the networks of trade that crisscrossed industrial Europe. Newspapers carried reports of seizures, barrels of butter that, when opened, revealed foul-smelling mixtures more akin to soap than food. In France, entire warehouses were discovered stocked with counterfeit dairy, ready to be sold under false labels. The crime was not hidden in alleys or dens of thieves. It was conducted by respectable merchants, farmers, and factory owners who saw no shame in replacing quality with profit. If the first wave of butter fraud was built on quiet substitutions, chalk, lard, mashed potatoes, the second wave was built on science. In the 1860s, a French chemist named Hippolyte Miegemeries developed a process for turning animal fats into a butter-like spread. It was initially intended to provide a cheap substitute for the French army and working poor. The invention was called margarine. While Miegemeries may have been motivated by pragmatism rather than crime, his discovery opened a floodgate. Industrialists seized on the formula, mass-producing margarine and marketing it as butter, often fraudulently. The difference in production costs meant staggering profits. The butter wars begin. As margarine factories expanded across Europe, dairy farmers saw their markets collapse. Butter, once a premium product, now had competition that looked, spread, and even tasted similar. But the economic harm wasn't the only issue. Much of the margarine of the early years was poorly made, rancid, or bulked with dangerous additives. Farmers organized protests. Pamphlets warned that margarine was a poisonous substitute. Butter guilds lobbied governments for protection, framing the fraud as not just economic sabotage but a public health crisis. The battle between dairy and margarine became so intense that it was often referred to as the butter wars. Legal crackdowns. Governments across Europe scrambled to respond. Britain passed the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act in 1860, the first attempt to control food fraud. Later acts specifically targeted butter fraud, requiring honest labeling and imposing fines on those who sold adulterated products as pure butter. In Germany and France, similar regulations emerged, including strict inspections and the seizure of suspect goods. Butter became a matter not just of taste but of law, its purity policed with the same vigilance as currency or medicine. But regulation was not enough to stop the practice. The profits were too high and enforcement too inconsistent. Inspectors could not be everywhere. Fraudulent butter continued to slip into kitchens, hidden behind labels and promises. Smuggling and secrecy. As restrictions tightened, another form of crime appeared: butter smuggling. In some countries, margarine was legal but heavily taxed. In others, it was banned outright. Traders skirted the rules, moving barrels across borders at night, relabeling goods at ports, bribing customs officials. The smuggling rings turned butter into a black market commodity, no less illicit than alcohol in Prohibition America. Criminal groups discovered that while robbing banks carried the risk of gallows, selling margarine as butter promised wealth with far less danger. The public reacts. For the average working-class family, the issue was complicated. Many could not afford real butter, and margarine offered a cheaper alternative. But they were caught between necessity and suspicion. Could they trust what they were eating, or were they feeding their children something toxic? Newspapers ran exposés on butter crimes, printing lurid descriptions of adulterated mixtures pulled from warehouses. One British editorial thundered, "If the crime of counterfeiting coin is punishable by prison, then the crime of counterfeiting food, that which nourishes the poor, is a crime against life itself." By the final decades of the 19th century, the butter fraud crisis reached its peak. What had begun as a quiet deception in village markets had grown into a vast industrial problem stretching across Europe. For governments, it became clear: butter was not merely food. It was politics, economics, and public health combined. The courtroom battles. One of the most telling signs of the scandal's scale was the flood of prosecutions. Across Britain, Germany, France, and the Netherlands, traders and factory owners were dragged into court, accused of adulterating butter with margarine, chalk, starch, and worse. Court records from the time describe barrels opened in front of judges, revealing not golden pats of dairy but rancid, soap-like mixtures. Witnesses testified about their illnesses, claiming that bad butter had left them bedridden. In Britain, Newspapers delighted in reporting every trial, framing each as a moral contest between honest dairy farmers and unscrupulous profiteers. Convictions often carried heavy fines, and in some cases prison terms. Yet the sheer profitability of fraud meant that, for every conviction, many more cases slipped through unnoticed. Farmers versus factories. The rise of margarine ignited one of the earliest debates about food authenticity. Dairy farmers saw themselves as defenders of tradition, producing butter through laborious, honest means. Industrialists argued that margarine was a practical, even democratic invention, a way to feed the poor at lower cost. But the reality was murkier. The poor could indeed afford margarine, but too often it was sold dishonestly as butter, robbing them of the ability to choose. And while margarine would eventually become a legitimate product in its own right, its beginnings were rooted in fraud and mistrust. The cultural divide deepened. Butter became a symbol of purity and heritage, while margarine carried the stain of scandal, a reputation it struggled to shed for generations. Long-term consequences. The butter heist had ripple effects that reached far beyond dairy markets. Food safety laws strengthened. Governments realized that food fraud was not a niche issue, but a national threat. The scandal paved the way for modern food safety regulations, inspections, and the idea that governments had a responsibility to guarantee what citizens ate. Consumer awareness grew. Ordinary people began demanding transparency in food production. For the first time, buyers questioned not just the quality but the very identity of the food they purchased. Industrial food took shape. Ironically, while margarine began as fraudulent, it eventually became normalized. Once regulations required honest labeling, margarine developed its own market, becoming a staple in working-class households throughout the 20th century. A quiet but profound crime. The butter scandal was not violent. There were no masked robbers, no dramatic chases, no glittering jewels. Yet it may have been more disruptive than many headline crimes of its day. It attacked the trust that what one bought to eat was safe, that merchants were honest, that survival itself was not at risk. For the families who suffered illness and for the farmers who lost livelihoods, the damage was deeply personal. For society, the lesson was systemic. Even the most ordinary foods could become weapons of deceit. Story 8. The Silent Poisoner. The arsenic baking scandal of Victorian England. In Victorian England, bread was more than food. For much of the working class, it was the foundation of the daily diet. A loaf of bread, often paired with weak tea or broth, might constitute the only meal a family ate in a day. To tamper with bread was to tamper with survival itself. But in the mid-19th century, a quiet, insidious crime swept through English bakeries: the contamination of flour and sugar with arsenic. Some cases were deliberate, some the result of negligence, but all carried devastating consequences. The importance of the baker. At the time, bakers were central figures in their communities. Few families could afford ovens at home, so bread was bought fresh daily from local shops. Trust in the baker was absolute. The smell of warm bread was a signal of comfort, continuity, and life itself. But the Victorian era was also a time of rampant food adulteration. With little regulation and fierce competition, bakers often cut corners. Alum and chalk were added to whiten bread, mashed beans or rice flour were mixed into dough to make it cheaper, and spoiled ingredients were hidden beneath layers of sugar or spice. Against this backdrop, the appearance of arsenic in bread and cakes seemed almost inevitable. The Bradford sweet poisoning of 1858. The most infamous case unfolded in the industrial town of Bradford, Yorkshire. On a cold October evening, a local sweet shop owner ordered peppermint lozenges to be made for his customers. The lozenges were prepared by a local confectioner who, instead of sugar, mistakenly used a powder supplied by his druggist. That powder was arsenic trioxide. The result was catastrophic. Within hours of consuming the lozenges, townspeople fell violently ill. Convulsions, vomiting, and excruciating pain spread rapidly. By the end of the crisis, 21 people were dead and more than 200 were poisoned. The scandal gripped the nation. Newspapers called it the Great Poisoning, demanding to know how such a mistake could occur in a civilized society. How it happened. The chain of negligence was shocking. In the Victorian era, chemists and grocers often worked side by side. Arsenic, widely used in industry for dyes and pest control, was stored in bulk. Its fine white powder resembled flour or sugar, and labeling was often lax. In the Bradford case, the confectioner had sent an assistant to fetch sugar from the local druggist. The assistant was given a barrel that looked the part, but instead contained pure arsenic. The lozenges were produced and sold without suspicion, setting off one of the deadliest episodes of mass food poisoning in British history. The public outcry. The horror of Bradford sent shockwaves through Victorian society. For ordinary citizens, the poisoning confirmed their darkest fears. The food they relied on could be fatal. Trust in bakers, confectioners, and grocers collapsed. Editorials demanded reform. One paper thundered, "The poor man with his scanty loaf is poisoned by those who should nourish him. Are we to allow death to be sold by the pound, unmarked, unchecked, unpunished?" The incident exposed not only the dangers of negligence, but also the fatal consequences of a world where arsenic was as common in shops as flour itself. The Bradford disaster of 1858 was not an isolated event. It was the most visible, the most public, but it was part of a broader, unsettling pattern in Victorian life, the infiltration of poison into ordinary food. Arsenic everywhere. In the 19th century, arsenic was everywhere. It colored wallpapers in brilliant greens, preserved timber, killed vermin, and enhanced dyes in clothing. Women wore gowns tinted with arsenic-based pigments. Children played in nurseries papered with arsenic-laced designs. The very air in some homes carried its poisonous trace. For food, the danger came from proximity. Arsenic sat in apothecaries, shops beside sugar, alum, or flour. Its resemblance to baking staples made it a constant risk. Accidental substitutions, a scoop from the wrong barrel, a mislabeled sack were not rare. And sometimes, substitution was not an accident. Deliberate adulteration. Beyond mishaps, some bakers and confectioners knowingly used additives that contained or bordered on poisonous. Chalk to whiten flour, alum to make bread appear finer, even plaster of Paris in some cases to bulk out dough. While these weren't outright arsenic, they blurred the line between food and chemical. To the poor, bread was cheapened. To the seller, profits fattened. And once the practice of adulteration became common, the step from carelessness to catastrophe was all too easy. Investigators step in. The Bradford case prompted immediate inquiry. Coroners, medical examiners, and chemists descended on the town, studying the corpses and the lozenges. The conclusion was swift and damning: systemic negligence, aided by lack of oversight. Parliament was forced to act. Within months, lawmakers debated stricter controls on the sale of poisons. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 eventually emerged, restricting arsenic and other dangerous substances to licensed chemists and requiring clear labeling. It was the first step toward modern poison control, though far from perfect. The fear in every household. Even as laws shifted, the fear remained. Newspapers sensationalized every poisoning case. Rumors spread in villages that bakers had laced loaves with death. Housewives inspected flour with suspicion, some resorting to elaborate tests, boiling flour, tasting raw dough, sniffing for oddness. And the terror was not unfounded. Reports surfaced of small poisonings continuing, families sickened after a pie, children struck ill after sweets. Even when not fatal, the presence of arsenic left scars of mistrust. From accident to symbol, the arsenic bread scandal became more than a local crisis. It became a symbol of industrial modernity's dangers. The Victorian era prided itself on progress: railways, factories, chemistry. But progress had a shadow: contamination, adulteration, negligence in the name of profit. Bread, the symbol of sustenance, became the symbol of betrayal. And arsenic, once a trusted tool in medicine and industry, became synonymous with hidden peril. By the time the Bradford poisoning faded from headlines, the shockwaves it had unleashed were still rolling through England. What seemed like a freak accident revealed something much deeper: the fragility of food safety in an industrial age. The trials and their limits. In the aftermath of the Bradford disaster, there were arrests. The confectioner who made the lozenges, the druggist who supplied the powder, and the assistant who fetched it all faced scrutiny. Yet the court cases revealed how ill-equipped the law was to deal with such crimes. There had been no intent to kill, no deliberate murder. Instead, what emerged was a chain of negligence, each man passing responsibility to the next. The result: minimal sentences. Most escaped with fines or short prison terms, far lighter than the grieving families felt justice demanded. This legal weakness highlighted a grim truth. In Victorian England, death by negligence in food supply was not yet seen as homicide. Public health awakens. The outrage over these light punishments added momentum to the growing public health movement. Reformers, already pushing against contaminated milk, dangerous housing, and polluted water, now had another rallying cry: clean, honest food. Newspapers became allies in the cause. They published exposés on bakers using chalk, butchers disguising rotten meat, and grocers selling tea leaves dyed with copper salts. The Bradford case gave these campaigns urgency and public sympathy. Step by step, pressure mounted, and by the 1870s and 1880s, new legislation required inspections, standardized labeling, and penalties for adulteration. The cultural impact of fear. Even as reform spread, arsenic left a cultural scar. To many Victorians, it became the symbol of the hidden dangers of modern life. Mystery writers capitalized on this fear, weaving arsenic into detective fiction as the quintessential poison of choice. Households changed habits. Some families insisted on grinding their own flour, despite the expense. Others avoided sweets from small shops, fearing another Bradford. Arsenic was no longer a neutral chemical, it was the specter at the dining table. The irony of progress. By the end of the century, margarine, canned goods, and processed foods were entering kitchens. Each new invention promised cheaper meals and modern convenience. Yet the lesson of arsenic remained. Innovation without oversight was a recipe for disaster. In some ways, the Bradford disaster was less about arsenic itself, and more about what it revealed: the blind spots of a rapidly industrializing society. The belief that commerce could regulate itself had been shattered. Story 9. The Great Gold Dust Swindle of 19th-Century London. In Victorian London, the city's financial district pulsed with energy. Merchants, bankers, brokers, and clerks carried fortunes through counting houses every day. Among the most precious commodities exchanged was gold dust, tiny particles of wealth, measured by weight, carried in leather bags, and entrusted to traders. Gold dust was particularly tricky. Unlike coins stamped with the authority of the crown, dust could only be judged by scales, the precision of measurement, and the honesty of the person doing the weighing. A single fraction of a grain could mean the difference between profit and ruin. And in this fragile system, opportunity for fraud lurked everywhere. Why gold dust mattered. Much of the gold dust arriving in London came from colonies and mining regions abroad: California, Australia, Africa. Prospectors sent their winnings home, or traders brought it into the market to be melted down into bullion. Each bag of dust represented not only money, but trust, that the scales were accurate, that the weights used were genuine, and that the man behind the counter was dealing fairly. But as long as trust was required, swindlers were waiting to exploit it. The method of the swindle. The Great Gold Dust Swindle, uncovered in the mid-19th century, relied on a remarkably simple trick. Dishonest gold assiers and traders learned to manipulate their scales. By inserting nearly invisible springs or counterweights, they could make gold dust appear lighter than it really was. A bag that contained an ounce of gold might register only 3/4 on the scale. The trader would then claim the gold was of lower value, buy it cheaply, and sell it on for its full worth. To the untrained eye, the fraud was almost impossible to detect. The scales looked legitimate, the process appeared professional, and the victim walked away believing he had received a fair price. Discovery of the con. The swindle might have gone on for years unnoticed, were it not for the persistence of a handful of victims who compared their payments to market rates. Rumors began to circulate that certain firms consistently undervalued gold dust. Eventually, an assier's assistant, dissatisfied with his employer's corruption, revealed the scheme to authorities. Inspectors seized the doctored scales, exposing the hidden mechanisms that tilted the balance. The newspapers leapt on the story, dubbing it the Great Gold Dust Swindle. For a city already anxious about financial trickery, it was another reminder that even the instruments of trust could be corrupted. Public reaction. For the ordinary Londoner, the scandal confirmed what many already suspected, that the world of finance was riddled with deception. To them, the swindle was proof that crime did not always come with pistols or knives sometimes. It came with polished brass scales and a polite bow across a counter. The government, eager to restore confidence, promised reforms in how gold was assayed and weighed. Officials insisted that licensed assiers would now be closely monitored, their equipment inspected more rigorously. But beneath these promises, suspicion lingered. When the fraud of the gold assiers came to light, London's financial circles buzzed with unease. The scandal was not merely about a few crooked traders. It raised profound questions about the stability of trade itself. The anatomy of the rigged scales. Investigators, working under the scrutiny of both Parliament and the public, examined the seized scales in detail. What they found was ingenious in its simplicity. Small springs had been hidden beneath the balance pans, creating just enough resistance to skew the results. Some scales were weighted with microscopic grains of lead soldered into the beams. To the eye, they looked ordinary. Even in operation, the false readings were subtle discrepancy of a few grains at a time. But multiplied over dozens, then hundreds of transactions, the profit was enormous. The genius of the fraud lay in its invisibility. The victims trusted the precision of science, and in doing so, never thought to question it. The web of accomplices. As the inquiry deepened, it became clear that this was no lone operator's scheme. Workshops were discovered where crooked scales had been manufactured to order. Some gold traders knowingly bought these instruments, while others feigned ignorance, happy to benefit from good fortune in their dealings. Evidence suggested that certain clerks were complicit too, quietly taking commissions from the extra profit. In a city where low wages met high temptations, silence was easy to buy. The legal struggle. The prosecution faced a challenge. Fraudulent scales were proof of deception, but proving intent was harder. Traders argued that they had been unaware of the defect, or that the discrepancies were within natural tolerance. Courtrooms filled with experts chemists, assiers, engineers demonstrating how precise gold weighing must be. Jurors handled the tampered balances, seeing firsthand how easily trust could be broken. Some defendants were convicted and fined heavily, others escaped on technicalities. But the publicity alone dealt a heavier punishment. Reputations destroyed, businesses ruined, names forever tied to fraud. Ripples through the market. The scandal could not have come at a worse time. London was positioning itself as the global capital of finance, the trusted hub for bullion and banking. The revelation that scales could be corrupted struck at the heart of this ambition. Foreign traders hesitated. Letters from colonial merchants expressed fear that their gold might be undervalued. Confidence, the lifeblood of trade, was shaken. To restore trust, the Royal Mint and the Bank of England stepped in. They offered standardized weighing services, guaranteed by government authority. Slowly, confidence was rebuilt, though the memory of fraud never fully faded. A crime without violence, but not without victims. It is tempting to see the great gold dust swindle as a bloodless crime. No one was shot in the street. No vault was broken open. Yet the victims, small prospectors, colonial traders, men who had risked their lives in distant goldfields, felt the loss keenly. Some lost entire fortunes through systematically undervalued sales. Others, upon hearing of the scandal, realized too late that they had been defrauded years earlier. The true number of victims was never fully known. By the late 1850s, the scandal of the rigged scales had largely passed through the courts, but the consequences stretched far beyond the sentences handed down. London was left with a profound question. Could the world's financial capital truly be trusted to weigh its own wealth? From courtrooms to Parliament, the trials had exposed not only dishonest traders, but also the weakness of existing laws. Fraud, when executed subtly, lived in a gray zone between negligence and deliberate theft. Judges urged Parliament to intervene, and soon debates emerged over how to protect both domestic and foreign traders. Committees were formed to consider reforms. Members of Parliament heard testimony from merchants, goldsmiths, and even colonial representatives. The refrain was the same. Confidence in British trade depended on confidence in its measures. The eventual outcome was stricter oversight of assiers and more consistent inspections of weighing equipment, modest reforms at first, but ones that would grow into a larger framework of consumer protection. The rise of standardized assay offices. In the wake of the scandal, the Royal Mint took on an increasingly central role. Rather than relying on private assiers, traders were encouraged to submit their dust to government-controlled assay offices. Here, gold could be melted, weighed, and stamped with official marks of purity and weight. It was slower and less convenient, but the seal of authority restored trust. Over time, the practice of trading raw gold dust in casual exchanges declined. It was too vulnerable to fraud, too dependent on instruments that could be tampered with. London moved toward dealing in coins, bars, and certified bullion. The broader lesson for finance. The gold dust swindle was not unique in its mechanics. Rigged scales had existed for centuries, but it struck at a symbolic heart of Victorian finance. The balanced scale, a device long associated with fairness and justice, had been corrupted. This image lingered in public memory. Newspapers invoked it whenever other financial scandals erupted, reminding readers that even the most objective instruments could serve crime. Writers of the time seized on the scandal, weaving it into cautionary tales about greed and the hidden machinery of fraud. For ordinary readers, the lesson was clear. Numbers and measurements could lie, and even the city's polished respectability could mask deception. The victims remembered. Historians later pieced together the extent of the losses. Colonial merchants sending gold from Australia and California had been among the hardest hit, their fortunes reduced by careful manipulations on London's counting house tables. Many never saw restitution. Some ruined families faded into obscurity, their misfortune buried under the progress of global finance. For them, the swindle was not just a curiosity of history, but a personal tragedy. a legacy in shadows. As London solidified its place as the world's financial capital in the late 19th century, the gold dust swindle became part of its folklore. It was whispered about in taverns near the Royal Exchange, retold in cautionary lectures, and remembered by reformers whenever new laws on trade were debated. The physical rigged scales, preserved as evidence, became grim artifacts, reminders that crime did not always need violence or notoriety. Sometimes it required only patience, clever engineering, and the blindness of trust.